Thank you, and thank you for being here. I figured the last few minutes of the last day, and I know I've got some really stiff competition with Dr. Datar and some of the other speakers today. So I really appreciate you being here. This is just a little table of contents of things I'm going to be talking about. I'm basically going to be giving a little bit of a background in toxicology, just a little toxicology theory, a little review, hopefully. Some case studies. Two of them were associated with baits. The first one actually happened here and affected a bunch of animals that ended up at the local SPCA. Number two did not involve an SPCA, but it very well could have. It did involve a large number of stray animals and loosely owned animals. The last one, upper respiratory infections, is kind of one that I did work with an SPCA on, and it's kind of made up because I didn't have really good documentation. It was mostly telephone consults. But if we have time, I'll get to that. So, Toxicology 101. This is my street cred up here. That's my Syph. He was a Tompkins County SPCA kitty cat, and he's pretty stinking awesome. So, first question, what is an LD50? What does it mean? Is it A, 50 little dogs, B, latitude and direction 50 degrees, C, lethal dose for half of a population, or D, latero-dorsal 50th meridian? Okay, excellent, good start. Half of the population. I was a little afraid some of you might jump on the little dogs, but guess not today. So what is dose-response theory? I don't know if anyone has had a little background in this. I put up a picture here of a gentleman named Philippus Areolus Theophrasis Bombastus von Hinheim, who wanted to go down in history, and he actually was a genius. He was the first person to think of dose-response theory. So, and he was from the 1500s. He knew that people would remember him for hundreds of years after because of his work. So what do you think the first thing Philippus Areolus Theophrasis Bombastus von Hinheim did to make sure he'd go down in posterity? He called himself Paracelsus. He changed his name to a little bit easier. But he came up with this thing called dose-response theory. And what is dose-response theory? It's the thing that just about anything can be poisonous under certain circumstances. And a lot of that has to do with the dose. It's the dose that makes the poison. You can also argue that the route of administration is kind of important too. For example, you can drink enough water to flush out your kidneys. That would be a poisonous principle of water. On the other hand, if you inhaled water, that would also be really bad for you. So route of exposure is also really important when we're talking about these things. So the dose that makes the poison, and these are rat LD50 doses. For potassium cyanide, or sodium cyanide in this case, pretty small, 6 mg per kg, whereas when we get to sodium chloride, it's more like 3 grams per kg. Okay, so you can poison something with table salt, but it takes a lot more, whereas cyanide doesn't take a whole lot. And what are some ways animals are exposed to toxicants? And this is, kind of an open-ended question, if any of you have any ideas. Eating, right, and that's probably going to be number one, right? Topical, that's also real strong. Inhalant, that's probably number two. Or topical, between that and topical are probably number two. How about another one? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, ocular, yeah, that would be, mucous membrane exposure. Injectable, if I thought they're wrong. Exactly, injectable, so parenteral. And I just put this up here as an image to remind me of parenteral routes of administration. Has anyone heard of Georgi Markovi? Georgi Markovi was somebody my toxicology professor told me about. I wasn't sure I believed it, but it's really true because I've seen it documented, not just on Wikipedia either, so it's actually really true. But this image is from Wikipedia. So Georgi Markovi was a Bulgarian dissident living in London, and he was a radio broadcaster. He broadcasted Radio Free Europe. He made himself very unpopular with the KGB, and one day he was going to work and somebody bumped him with an umbrella, And he got a bruise on his thigh, but he didn't think of anything of it until he died 2 days later from ricin poisoning. And it turned out that the umbrella actually had an injection pod in it, so it could inject this little ball, little metal ball that was impregnated with ricin. It had some holes punched in it, and it was impregnated with ricin. And it was enough to kill him. It doesn't take very much ricin. It's a big molecule, so the LD50 is actually kind of high on it, but it really only takes a few molecules to kill you. So another thing that we worry about in veterinary medicine, size differences. The itty-bitty baby kitten or the hamster is going to have a little different threshold for what it can withstand than the Great Dane, right? So you guys all know that stuff inside and out, no doubt. And I just represent, so I did have worked on this species, the whale shark, briefly. So that's kind of fun. And then species, there's other things that go into species difference besides size, like individual metabolic differences. So cats are too good for this world, really. They are just super, they don't have the same metabolic enzymes as everybody else does, so they're extremely susceptible to a lot of different toxicants, whereas other animals, much less susceptible. So acetaminophen is a major one that we think of as being a problem in cats. It is a problem in dogs too, but they can withstand much higher doses than cats can. I make my students answer a question on their final exam every year, and I've always threatened to fail anyone who gets it wrong. So far, nobody's actually taken me up on that offer yet. But it is, what is the recommended oral dose of acetaminophen for a cat? 0. Never give acetaminophen to a cat. And I just put in nitrates. Nitrates, if a cat or a dog or a rat or a human eats feed containing nitrates, or a horse, it's usually not a huge problem. But if it's a cow, because of their different digestive process, they can be poisoned pretty easily. So a lot of toxicology is kind of trying to put things in different perspectives. So I do tend to see things from a different perspective than a lot of people, but I do really like this this little off-the-mark comic strip, because, yeah. I have a friend in toxicology, actually. She went out to her, she worked in a diagnostic lab where they necropsied a lot of horses and cattle, and she went out one day and she said, "Why is my neighbor using rib cutters to trim his hedges?" So people have different ways of seeing things. So has everybody been in Collegetown yet? They have some awesome restaurants down there. It's a pretty cool place. So this is a case study. One person in the audience is familiar with it already. And the pictures I actually took, the pictures of animals I actually took from newspaper stories related to this particular incident, okay? So this is Collegetown. It's about a 1 kilometer area. So this was a colony of about 20 to 30 community cats that lived there. People in the community took care of them. A few days before this happened, the New York Times published an article that said cats are adorable little serial killers that are going to make birds extinct. So you remember those articles, right? So one day, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, a cat was found dead. There were several other cats that were being humanely trapped for the TNR program, and they were not right. So they were euthanized. And this is some more pictures of some cats involved. There was a neurologic mother cat, and the kittens appeared to be unaffected. 2 more cats were found dead in the area over the weekend. During this period, there was a mother and 6 kittens who were there for observation. And they did recover a partially covered food bowl, and it was pouring rain this day, okay? It was pouring rain out. The food bowl was partially covered under a little awning, and it came in at 5:30 on a weeknight, which is actually, it's usually 5:30 on a Friday, so 5:30 on a Monday is not so bad. But it came in at 5:30 on a Monday, and I was in the office, so I took it, and I put it in the freezer. So this is what it looked like. So this is cat food that's been sitting out in the rain for a couple hours. Anybody notice anything off about it? Just for a glance. Have you ever seen cat food that's been sitting in water for a few hours? It expands, right? This is not that expanded. And you can see a little bit, but it's not puffy like you would totally expect, right? There's something weird about it. So differential diagnoses, what could be going on? Does anybody want to throw out some ideas? I mean, usually in a case where you start seeing a couple of dead cats, it's usually hit by car, right? But something else is going on. We've got cats that are having seizures. We've got multiple cats affected. We got cats in traps affected. Any ideas? Rat poison would be on the list. There are a few different kinds of rat poisons, and I'll show you some different rat poison baits towards the end. Antifreeze is a big one. Preservatives? Maybe. Now, there used to be some preservatives in cat foods that caused increased red cell destruction, but we don't use those too much anymore, thankfully. They're still in dog foods and things. They normally don't cause avert poisonings, though. OP? Yeah, so insecticides like organophosphate. That would definitely go with the seizures, and that's where I was going with this case. I was wrong. So on gross necropsy, the kidneys were enlarged, and on impression smear using polarized light and a microscope, you got these shiny birefringent crystals. And also, this is the exact same picture of the cat food that I had before, but I'm going to tell you now, this was not when I received it. This was after it had been in the freezer overnight. So you notice it still has a lot of liquid around it. So now I have my diagnosis, right? We call this in my lab, we call this the Eggo test, because we got an Eggo that was soaked in ethylene glycol once. If it's soaked in ethylene glycol and you put it in the freezer overnight, it won't freeze. So we had our diagnosis now. This was antifreeze. Of course, you guys already got this, right? I put arsenic in because everybody likes to yell arsenic whenever we talk toxicology. So in this case, it was definitely antifreeze. And there are some test kits that you can use on the bedside. Some of them do have cross reactions with other alcohols, so besides ethylene glycol. So you would need to take the sample before you treat the animal with anything. The other problem we have with these, and even with our gold standard test, the mass spec screen, is if it's been more than about 12 hours, the cat will have completely metabolized the ethylene glycol and the test will come back negative, even if they were exposed. So that's something that we have trouble with a lot. So when I have an animal that's put more than 12 hours post-exposure, they're probably not going to survive, unfortunately. And so in those cases, I usually recommend postmortem examination as the method of diagnosis, because you're much more likely to get a positive ethylene glycol diagnosis from the pathologist, from the toxicologist at that point. And this is the reason. So when they first ingest it, and this is when actually some of the cats started dying really early on with neurologic signs, probably somewhere between the gastroenteritis and inebriation stage and the acidosis stage. So they were getting, basically they were getting drunk because it is an alcohol, and gastroenteritis, they will vomit some, and then acidosis, which can cause some of the neurologic signs we also saw. And then after 12 hours or so, then you start seeing the kidney failure. And the reason for that is just the way that this is diagnosed, is metabolized. So you see on the top of this flow chart is ethylene glycol. That's a parent compound. That's what we test for. And then it's metabolized to glycoaldehyde, glycolate, which is the acid. Glycolate causes acidosis. That's where you get the acid. Glyoxylate, and then that's metabolized to oxalate. Oxalate is the crystals that form in the kidney. So the oxalate is actually a compound that circulates. When it finds calcium, it binds it and makes a crystal. So there's a lot of calcium in the kidneys, so it will crystallize in the kidneys. But it's also found in other areas like the brain. So these are the crystals you might see in the urine if you're lucky. Half the time you aren't going to see any changes in the urine at all, as far as crystalluria is concerned anyway. You will see increased phosphorus in the serum, increased osmolar gap. That's because this ethylene glycol is a compound that is basically changing the osmolarity of the plasma and serum. It's not supposed to be there, so it's not something you would normally measure. So it comes back as an unknown. Increase in the osmolar gap. Anion gap, same thing. The glycolate is forming. It's creating more anions, so you have an increased anion gap. And acidosis. Later on, so the early increase in phosphorus is actually because there's phosphorus in ethylene glycol. It's added to ethylene glycol. The later increase with increased phosphorus, hypocalcemia, hyperkalemia, that is actually due to the beginning of renal failure. And then the elevated BU and creatinine. Urinalysis, isostenuria as they go into kidney failure, sediments, and you might get these nice birefringent crystals. And that's what it looks like microscopically in the kidney. So we have some normal-ish kidney tissue here. This is a glomerulus, so that's the filter system. And then here's a tubule and some other tubules. There's a little death going on in this tubule. But you can see some of the tubules are kind of distended, and the cells don't quite look normal, and they have crystals inside them. That's what the ethylene glycol does to the kidneys. It blocks up the kidney tubules with crystals. They perforate the cells, and you get loss of cells in the kidneys. So, how do you treat them? This is courtesy of the ASPCA. They actually just went and got some newspaper clippings from different places where they've treated cats. Usually you use vodka or Everclear or some other source of ethanol. So if we go back to this flow chart, doesn't really say. Oh yeah, there it does say. So alcohol dehydrogenase, that's the enzyme in the liver that takes care of alcohol. So after like last night, when you guys all were in Collegetown, that's the enzyme that kind of, once you've gotten drunk, it kind of works its way through the ethanol until you're sober again. So coffee helps, but this enzyme is, you owe it all to alcohol dehydrogenase, okay? However, alcohol dehydrogenase makes acidic substances that give you the hangover effect, right? So in this case, it makes acidic substances that cause acidosis, and eventually you get the crystalluria. But if you can block that enzyme with something, then you can prevent all the stuff that happens afterwards. So you're blocking it with ethanol. You're putting these animals in an ethanol coma. The other one you can use is 4-MP, 4-methylpyrazole. It's great. You can give it to them, and it doesn't have adverse effects, so they don't get drunk, they don't go into a coma. It doesn't sedate them, it doesn't give them a hangover, doesn't make them mean, but it's really expensive and you can never get a hold of it. It's really hard to come by. So ethanol is usually where you're going to go. I just put some protocols in here, and we have our friend up there with Black Cat again. So these are actually going to be in the notes that they're saving for y'all. So prognosis is actually pretty good if they're treated early. I would say probably even a little less than 8 hours for kitty cats, but grave after about 12 hours, because what you're doing is you're blocking that first step. You're blocking that alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. So anything that's already happened is not, you can't change it. So you got to get them early before they start metabolizing the ethylene glycol significantly. And it worked in this little patient. So this is case study 2. This is actually, these photos are not from my case study, but from something similar that happened in Oregon a few years later. My case study is from Oklahoma. I used to work there. And we had a dog owner who was actually a veterinary student. And he came in and he had some dogs that ingested some kind of raw meat. They came home, the pregnant bitch came over and she barfed up a bunch of raw meat right in front of the kennel. These dogs, by the way, is really common in certain parts of the country, as some of you probably know, for dogs to roam. Not so common here. Very common in Oklahoma. The vet student was usually really good about keeping his dogs kenneled, but they escaped one day. Okay? So they just happened to escape on the very wrong day. And he had 3 dogs escape. The pregnant dog recovered. 2 other dogs had progressive clinical signs. And because he was a veterinary student, he did something that makes us all very happy. He saved the vomit. We were so excited about that. I like looking, well, I won't go so far to say I like looking through vomit, but I have gotten so many answers from looking through vomit that it's not funny. So if you get vomit that's a possible bait, definitely save it for me. He actually walked into his neighbor's yard and recovered the bait as well, which was basically ground hamburger meat. So within a few days, this vet student's landlady, who also had dogs, and she let her dogs roam, her dogs were affected. A third owner had lost a cat and not really thought anything of it, but then they lost a dog. And throughout the neighborhood, people were finding dead dogs, dead cats, dead chickens. So early on, these dogs would experience some vomiting, and the pregnant dog, she vomited right away, and that probably saved her life, right? Because all of the other dogs in this household died. In fact, it definitely saved her life. They had some chemistry changes, including increased blood urea nitrogen pretty early on, and then they started going into respiratory distress that just didn't get better no matter what you did. Okay, you put them in the oxygen cage, but they were still rasping and wheezing and gasping for breath. On rads, there was an interstitial pattern. So what are you going to send me? You've got this case. What are you going to send to the diagnostic lab, me or Dr. Poppingay or whatever diagnostic lab you use, for me to help you diagnose it? Freshly dead animal, excellent. Cold, not frozen. Oh, we love cold, not frozen. Thank you very much. We do. What else? Vomitus, yep. What else? The bait that somebody found, and maybe some samples from the living patients if you can get them. And by the way, do not freeze the remains, but you can freeze anything else. So if you take tissues, if you take urine, don't freeze the blood because then it hemolyzes and it's a mess. But you can freeze urine, serum, plasma. You can freeze any of that other stuff for me. The pathologists don't like it when you freeze the remains because then they can't read the slides because the ice crystals break up all the cells and it's just smush. So, but you can freeze the vomitus. We love it when you freeze the vomitus because otherwise it gets all rancid and stinky and nasty and we don't want to work with it. So if you want to stay on the good side of the toxicologist, you can freeze everything except the blood, but if you want to stay on the good side of the pathologist, don't freeze the carcass. So there we go. So submit everything. I may not test everything, and I only charge you for what I test, but send everything. So the pregnant dog survived, everybody else died. Everybody else died. And they died horribly. They died gasping for air. It was terrible. When we did the postmortem, normally when you do a postmortem, you open up the thoracic cavity and you hear kind of a whoosh as the air rushes in and the lungs collapse. In this case, the lungs stayed inflated, which is weird. And the kidneys were kind of pale. And this is actually from one of my dogs, one of the vet students' dogs, actually, one of our case. So I put a picture. I like microscopy. I really learn a lot from it, so I kind of put some microscopy in here. Sorry about that for y'all, but I did put a normal, what's supposed to look like lung in. So you can see this is lung. These are all the little alveoli, which are doing their thing. And you notice they're really skinny, right? They have these little, so they're these big air spaces with little skinny membranes in between them so that and those membranes have blood vessels, right? So the air can pass between the membranes and the blood. And the membrane, so these are cells with very little cytoplasm but lots of membrane. So the oxygen can travel back and forth to the blood. That's lung. This is the lungs from one of our patients, just full of blood. This is another one of our patients, and this is a close-up of the same thing. You can see the cells are changed, right? So instead of having these nice, so you can see right here, there's a nice kind of a flat cell right next to it, and then next to it there's this big cell bulging into the middle of the alveolus. That's not normal. Air's not going to get across there. Okay, we call those tombstone cells, which is somewhat apropos. There's some blood in there. And just the alveoli themselves are really thick. The air's not going to cross that very well. So that's why these animals were dying. There was collagen fiber being deposited in the alveolar walls. Massive fibrosis of these alveolar walls. They couldn't get the air. They can get the air in the alveoli, but they couldn't get it into the blood. And plus, once they got it into the alveoli, because of all this collagen, it just kind of set up a structure so that instead of collapsing when the animals, move their diaphragm and their rib cage, like it would in this lung up here, the lungs just kind of stayed the same. You couldn't push the air out either. So they weren't moving air, and they weren't moving oxygen from the air into the blood. So we tested the meat. The first thing I tested was the meat. And we used what was called a dithioate spot test. And actually, if you call Syngenta, the company that makes this product, Paraquat, they will give you, or at least they used to give you, a free dithioate spot test. And basically, I should say dithionite spot test. The dithionite spot test, you mix it with the urine of the patient or with the bait, and it will tell you if they got paraquat poisoning. And so basically, we analyze the vomit and the urine using this method, and then there's a laboratory in Washington State that can analyze tissues. And usually, in this case, we almost never ask you to submit lung for poisoning, but in this case, lung is the target organ, so it actually was a really good sample to submit for analysis for paraquat. And this is what it looks like. It's a restricted use herbicide, which means that you can only use it under strict regulations, and you have to have training. Although this guy basically got away with it because he said, I mixed it with, I left it, it was on my own property, so any animals that came on there shouldn't have been there anyway. But this is, if they had gone after him for use of a restricted pesticide in an unapproved way, then he probably would have gotten a little bit more legal consequences than he did, which was 0, unfortunately. But this stuff is common in Asia, it's common on the islands, and all species are susceptible. Humans who ingest this are going to die too. There really aren't good treatments for this. Most of the patients, if they ingest enough of it, dose response, again, if you don't get very much, you may survive, but you'll probably have permanent damage to your lungs. But if you get more than, a lethal dose, you're going to die, no matter what the doctors do for you. The case in Portland where I showed the picture, these dogs actually were an incident that happened in Portland a few years after the Oklahoma incident. And 11 out of 14 dogs that were exposed died. In our case, the only dog that survived was the dog that had vomited immediately after ingestion of the bait. So basically, this is what it is. This paraquat is a pro-oxidant. It reacts with oxygen to form superoxide radicals, oxygen-free radicals. The oxygen-free radicals attack cell membranes, destroy cell membranes. Without cell membranes, you have cell death. So that's why you have these big puffy cells, because the cells in the lungs are trying to regenerate as fast as they can to make up for all the cells that have died. So phase 1 is basically the cells in the GI tract getting affected. Phase 2 is the cells of the kidneys getting affected. Phase 3, the lungs have an uptake mechanism that specifically grabs paraquat and brings it inside the cells. So if you're going to have something that reacts with oxygen to cause oxygen-free radicals, the last place you want it is in the lungs. But that's actually exactly where the stuff goes. So now what do you do? So what it's doing is it's taking the oxygen from the air and making it into toxic-free radicals. So how do you treat the patient? You can't not give them oxygen because they can't breathe, but you can't give them oxygen because that's just going to make it worse. it's really a tough decision. And then they get the pulmonary edema, the pulmonary hemorrhage, and pulmonary fibrosis that I showed you in the pictures. So you can't supplement them with oxygen, even though you want to, because they can't breathe. I mean, you see an animal that can't breathe, and the first thing you want to do is give them oxygen, and it's going to make it worse. There is this pirfenidone that they use in humans now. I think it's about $6,000 a dose, so it's really not going to be available to most veterinary practices anyway, let alone organizations that may not have the bottomless pockets. This particular stuff, what it does is it prevents collagen production. So it really gets to the heart of what Paraquat does, which is stimulating more collagen production through those oxygen-free radicals. And then prednisolone. I mean, there's really not a whole lot you can do for these guys, and they are probably going to die. So I told you I get a lot of information out of stomach contents, and I actually get a lot of information out of baits as well. So people send me a lot of baits. I just put in the middle, these are kind of old school rat baits. And one of the things, there's a few different active ingredients in rat baits. There's the anticoagulants, there's the bromethylene, which is a neurotoxin, and there's cholecalciferol, which is actually a vitamin D analog that basically turns their kidneys to rocks. And you can't tell by looking at them which is which. So we used to have these little, I think these are being phased out, these little packets with tiny baits in them, because the animals would go into the traps and they'd grab the packets and run away with them, and then other animals could find the packets and get poisoned. And actually it killed a bunch of animals at a major zoo once. The rodents were running in and getting the packets and bringing the little pellets in to the bird cages, and the birds were eating the pellets. So now they're making these blocks. These blocks are really waxy. They can be long, or they can be kind of short square cubes. So we see those. This one is interesting. I made this in the lab. The product used to be called, is still called Golden Mallorin. It used to be little yellow waxy things, and it's actually a fly bait. And it's called methomel. Does anybody know what they use this for that's not flies? Actually, if you look on the package now, because this is such a humongous problem, they actually have a picture of a raccoon with a red circle and a slash through it, meaning don't poison raccoons, although whoever their advertising person didn't quite get, I mean, basically, because that's what you do. So this is actually, I took some of this Golden Mallorin, which is now blue for whatever reason, and it's kind of now a blue dry pellet, and I mixed it in with, and what they do is they mix it in with Coca-Cola. So I mixed it in with Coca-Cola. It attracts raccoons, and they'll have pictures on the internet. Don't Google raccoons and methomel or raccoons and Golden Mallorin, because it's really depressing. But if you do, you get all these pictures of like raccoons around a bottle of Coke that's been poisoned with this stuff, because they don't get very far. It actually kills them really fast. So I put that in there. It's kind of, like I said, it's kind of a blue color, and this is just Coca-Cola. I felt like a total psycho the other day when I was making cat baits and raccoon baits and stuff. These are real baits. Anybody want to guess what this is? This is a meatball that somebody found containing. No, well, not rats. Gopher poison. Does anybody know what's in gopher poison? This is your typical strychnine. If you find that in a dog's stomach, and they don't get very far in strychnine, it kills really fast. So you'll probably find it in the stomach. If you find, it looks like birdseed, it's milo or grain sorghum, and it's dyed green. It's occasionally dyed red. I think I've seen red once in my life, but it's normally dyed green. Thankfully, we don't have it in New York. It's really hard to get a hold of in New York. I know I've tried, not to poison people's dogs, but to show people what it looks like. And it's really hard to get a hold of here, but it's still used in some parts of the country as gopher bait. This one, it's a hot dog that somebody mixed with something and then tied it back together. Any guesses? I believe this one is carbofuran, which is a pesticide, an insecticide that's been used a lot. And it is it's a carbamate, but it's very similar to organophosphate insecticides. It also kills pretty quickly. The other one that looks like this that's actually becoming more common now is called aldicarb. Aldicarb is basically being imported illegally from the Caribbean as a rat poison. And they call it, on the black market, they call it 3 steps. Okay, and basically it's because the animals walk 3 steps and then die. So they're really nasty. So these actually are methyl carbamates, this aldicarb, carbofuran, and also methomyl. But they're very similar to organophosphate compounds. And then this was actually a child's diaper, and the child had ingested rat poison, and that specific rat poison was bromethylene. That child had ingested bromethylene, but they got him to the hospital. Bromethylene is really challenging to treat as well. It's a neurotoxin, and it basically kills cats dead. With dogs, you have a bit of a chance. And there are creative people out there, unfortunately, who are in the business of poisoning things. I actually looked this guy up, this Judd Zellner. He is a wildlife removal specialist. And he's advertising online that you can get rid of your neighbor's dog by mixing meat with xylitol. So it's out there. This actually, there was a case where someone in Toronto area had gotten a bunch of the Moist Pouts cat treats and mixed them with Tylenol, powdered Tylenol, and given them to people on the street at a street fair. So a lot of cats died from Tylenol poisoning. This is actually not what this is. This is a Tylenol attached to a mouse, and they were using it to bait snakes in Guam to eradicate the brown tree snakes in Guam. But I have heard of it being used to kill people's cats as well. So some people know about these things, and they will use them. So let's see. This case is a bit waffled. So if everything I wrote in here doesn't ring 100% true, that's because I had to make some stuff up because I couldn't remember the actual case. But it actually did. Something like this definitely did happen, and this is the case of the snotty cats. So, outbreak of respiratory disease in cats. I know you guys have never seen anything like that happen before, right? Cats never get respiratory disease, right? So this is a small animal shelter. They have room for about 60 cats. They have they take in 2 or 3 cats a day, and they have 20 intake cages. So the animals come into intake for a few days after where they're vaccinated, and if they don't break with anything, they're moved to the next level, to the cages where people can adopt them or whatever, or their owners can claim them. So day 0, 2 cats brought in. They're put in the intake cages after being vaccinated and getting a quick physical exam. There's already a bunch of cats and kittens out in the intake cages. Sometimes all the adult cats have their own cage. Sometimes the kittens are kept together if they come from the same source. So the next day, you come in and the new cats are sneezing. So you move those to the isolation, and you move some of the kittens to the adoption area and one of the cats. And you do a thorough cleaning of the area, and you admit a few more cats. So the cleaning involves removing and replacing all the food and water bowls for cleaning, bedding removal and replacement, toy removal and replacement, disinfection, about a cup of bleach per gallon of water, cage surfaces, other surfaces, fixtures, and floors. The next day, the cats in the isolation, one has mucoid ocular discharge and the other one has serous ocular, and it also has serous ocular discharge. The first cat, one of the cats seems to be doing better. Intake area, now you got more serous nasal discharge, more serous ocular discharge from the day 1 intakes. Sneezing, and you move those cats into isolation. You have 2 unaffected cats moved to adoption, and 1 new cat comes in, and you repeat the same cleaning procedures you did the day before. So now isolation, you have a bunch of cats, a few kittens. The one cat still has, the one cat that came in sneezing on day 1, still sneezing, has a little bit of mucoid discharge. The others have serous ocular and nasal discharge. The intake carry, now you got 7 cats sneezing. So we're getting a few more cats sneezing and ocular discharge the other day. Every day, repeat cleaning. Day 4 is Sunday. And Monday, we're just going to forget what's happening at the clinic and just look at the diagnostic testing now. So the cat with mucoid discharge, you take some nasal and 2 other cats, you take some nasal swabs, blood, conjunctival scrapings, you run PCR for all these things that cause upper respiratory disease in kitty cats, CN, serum neutralization for some of the other viruses, cytology. And the one cat with the mucousy discharge has a lot of inflammation, no surprise, and some squamous cells from the ocular scrapings. Cats 2 and 3, just a little bit of inflammation, but mostly just squames. PCRs are negative. The one cat with the mucoid discharge does have herpes virus isolated by serum neutralization. Nobody has calicivirus. So we know we have herpes in cat 1, and we seem to have a nonspecific upper respiratory irritation in the other kitties. So what was the cause of the upper respiratory disease in this outbreak? Either overzealous cleaning, underzealous cleaning, and high ammonia. Everybody got herpes from the one infected cat, and we just haven't found it on diagnostic lab tests yet. Or paraquat. A, you think it was a little bit overzealous with the bleach, maybe? Too strong bleach solution, exactly. That's exactly what it was. They were using really strong bleach, and it was causing just basically, I mean, it was like being in a swimming pool 24/7 for these cats. The hypochlorite was just causing ocular damage. This actually happened near Toronto. They have all the bad luck up in Toronto. Near Toronto, this was a chlorine. The train was carrying tanks of chlorine gas, and it killed a few people, and they basically had to evacuate the town. Chlorine gas is really water soluble, which is sort of a good thing in some ways because it actually dissolves in the tears and in the mucous membrane secretions of the nasal cavity, which means that you don't get as much of it down into your lungs, causing lung damage. It mostly causes mucosal damage, so that's a good thing. You can get pulmonary involvement if it's enough gas, and indeed, chlorine gas has been used as a weapon in World War I. So it does cause pulmonary damage, but mostly it affects the mucous membranes of the upper respiratory tract in the eyes. And ammonia can do something similar. Smoke inhalation would have similar impacts as well. And basically, the treatment is ventilation. Get the cats plenty of air, dilute out the bleach. Don't put them back right away after you bleach the room. Let it air out. You can use, if they're really severely affected, you can use alpha-2 agonists. You can use to kind of open up their airways. You can flush the eyes and mucous membranes with water. Anti-inflammatories, antioxidants. And it is possible to get secondary infections if you get enough mucosal damage. If you get damage to the conjunctiva and to the cornea, you can get keratitis. You can get secondary viral infections in these kitty cats and secondary bacterial infections from the mucosal damage. So it is a possibility, but for the most part, the prognosis is excellent once you get them in fresh air and you get happy cats. And the moral of the story is follow the SOP. If a little is good, more is not necessarily better. Don't, if it smells like a swimming pool in there, you probably don't want to keep your cats in there. So fresh air, use the proper choice of chemicals. You know, don't necessarily use bleach in an enclosed space when you can use something like chlorhexidine, and dilute things properly. So in conclusion, and this is a picture that someone took, and I thought it was really interesting. Part of it, we're moving away from a lot of the old style anticoagulant rodenticides because we've had so many deaths in birds of prey. And you can see right here, this guy's eating the stomach from some kind of a rodent that had just eaten a rodenticide. And you can tell from the bright blue color that it was a rodenticide. So that's why we're not seeing as many of the anticoagulants now are going to be moving more towards bromoethylene and cholecalciferol type rodenticides in the future because of the damage to endangered species. And honestly, my lab tests test eagles, owls, hawks, foxes, and all kinds of upper trophic level predators, and they're all riddled with anticoagulant rodenticides because they're so abused in the US that they've just permeated the wildlife. And they're really, you really can't treat, I mean, these hawks and owls and stuff don't walk into a vet clinic asking for help, unfortunately. There's not much you can do. So you can't always tell what a bait is by looking at it, but you might get an idea. So it's worth looking at. It's worth submitting baits to the tox lab. It's worth submitting stomach contents for me to look at. Stomach contents are probably not going to be helpful with an anticoagulant rodenticide bait because it takes 3 days from the time they eat the bait until the time they get sick. So it will have passed by then. But you might see the blue in the fecal excretion or something like that. And when you have a doubt, when you don't know what to submit, when you don't know what's going on, but you think that we can help you, give us a call and we will do our best. And some of these tests, a lot of times somebody will say, well, I found this bait, well, I found these stomach contents, or I've got these stomach contents, and I'll just look at them and, a lot of times you want to order tests when you submit the sample. Well, if you call me, I can talk you through it, and maybe you'll submit the sample, and then I'll look at it and say, no, you don't want this test, you want this test. So I do that a lot. I mean, with the ego test, you may not even have to run an analysis, right? You can just say, oh, look, it didn't freeze, so we know we have ethylene glycol. With carbofuran, I can usually spot it in the bait and then confirm it using testing. So a lot of times, and it doesn't, depending on who you are, it probably isn't going to cost a lot for me to look at your stuff. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, with with an ASPCA or something, I'm not going to charge an awful lot to just look at the sample. But I might be able to tell you what's wrong. So I guess that's all I have. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for staying. Oh my gosh, I appreciate it.